A military psychiatrist examines the captured leaders of Nazi Germany to determine their sanity and better understand the nature of Nazism. One of his interlocutors is Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's closest associates and accomplices. The film, based on real events, begins in Germany on the 7th of May 1945. The Great Patriotic War is coming to an end. A unit of Allied American troops notices a German command car among the columns and civilian refugees and stops it. Inside is Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring with his family. Seeing the soldiers, Göring orders the driver to throw out a white flag as a sign of surrender. In the United States, Judge Robert Jackson is informed that Göring, the first person in the country after Hitler's death, has been arrested. Since the high-ranking officials of Nazi Germany are to be put on trial, Jackson is offered to lead this event. He hesitates. The scale of the trial is unprecedented, but ultimately agrees to participate in the International Tribunal, where, in addition to the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and the USSR, will act as prosecutors. A military psychiatrist, Douglas Kelly, is traveling by train to the town of Maundorf. Entertaining himself with tricks along the way, he meets journalist Lila. At the station, Sergeant Trist meets the doctor and takes the psychiatrist to Colonel Andrus, who is responsible for detaining the top of the Nazi regime. Douglas was brought in to provide an expert assessment of the prisoners, including Hermann Göring, before they stand trial. The psychiatrist learns that the prisoner takes 40 pills a day, but from experience, he understands that this is a powerful painkiller from the opiate family, essentially drugs. Trist, acting as a translator, leads the doctor to the Nazi to introduce them. During the brief conversation, Douglas realizes that Göring understands English, which he mentions to the sergeant on the way out. Suspecting him to be a clever and cunning narcissist, the only one among all the prisoners who might avoid a guilty verdict, the psychiatrist decides to delve into the personality of the Reichsmarschall. To do this, he wakes Trist in the middle of the night to go to the local library and scour it for laudatory books about the patient. Returning to the prisoner in the morning, he learns that Göring is experiencing asphyxia due to withdrawal from the pills. But Douglas manages to bring him to his senses using charm and persuasion. The next day, he conducts Rorschach tests with the German prisoners, those with ink blots. Unlike his colleagues, Göring directly states that he only sees spots without any associations, skillfully avoiding a potential diagnosis. In the United States, Judge Jackson, in order to achieve legitimacy for the upcoming trial, tries to convince world authorities of this. He seeks help from the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope blackmailing him into siding with the Allies. Otherwise, Catholics worldwide will be remembered as Nazi collaborators, since the Vatican was one of the first countries in the world to recognize their power. Göring, along with other prisoners, is transported by plane to Nuremberg, where the trial is to take place. On the way, Douglas entertains the patient with tricks at his request. In response, Göring promises to show a much more remarkable trick. He plans to avoid the death penalty. Upon arrival, the Nazis are assigned to prison cells, and Colonel Andrus personally explains that they will be closely watched here. The psychiatrist visits Göring in his cell to continue the conversation. The doctor has become obsessed with the idea of writing a book based on these talks. Jackson also arrives in the city. While inspecting the upcoming trial venue, he meets David Maxwell Fyfe, the British representative at the trial. Fyfe warns his American colleague that the case must be won. Otherwise, it could result in the rehabilitation of Nazism. To find the key to Göring's psychology, Douglas decides to play on his ego by asking for help with the difficult patient Rudolf Hess. Having flown to Britain in 1941 to negotiate with local collaborators about an alliance with Germany, Hess ended up in British captivity, where he feigned amnesia. Then, after admitting he faked the first amnesia, he began to feign a second one. Now, as he was being taken from England to Nuremberg, the psychiatrist could not confidently say that Hess was sane. To break him, help from a party comrade is needed. Gaining trust, Douglas seeks out Göring's wife and daughter to deliver letters from prison. Finding the patient's family, he introduces himself as a friend of the Reichsmarschall and takes the reply letters. When he and the sergeant return to the prison building, it is full of journalists. International lawyers are handing charges to the prisoners. Jackson learns from his assistant that the Nazi defense strategy will include justifying the invasion of Denmark and Norway by claiming that Britain wanted to occupy these neutral countries as a base for military operations even earlier. Fyfe confirms that such plans did indeed exist, but the Nazis acted before the Crown, and this scenario removes one lever of pressure. To understand what might It is possible to put pressure in the case of Göring, the most important person among the remaining Nazis. The judge meets with Dr. Douglas at night in the square where 10 years ago Hitler announced the adoption of the Nuremberg racial laws aimed against Jews. The lawyer asks the psychiatrist for help to understand how to win in court against the cunning and cold-blooded German. Talking with the prisoner about Hitler, Douglas realizes that he admired the Führer. Later, he reports to the lawyers that Göring holds the following position regarding the concentration camps. He conceived them as labor camps. The doctor hints that the legal basis of the charges by the victors is falling apart, and a seasoned narcissist and natural psychologist like Göring will easily convince the entire court that he is not so guilty. The situation worsens when, despite all precautions, Robert Ley, an SA Obergruppenführer, is found dead in his cell, having decided not to wait for the trial. Suspecting Douglas of sympathizing with Göring, they assign him a partner, Dr. Gilbert, for a more accurate assessment of the prisoners. Gilbert first suggests to his colleague to become a co-author of the book for which he is gathering material. After all, the chance to become famous as the psychologists of the Nazis doesn't come every day. But Douglas politely declines, pretending that there is no book. He continues to visit Göring's wife and daughter, passing messages from them to the prisoner. A more friendly and trusting relationship develops between him and the patient. Douglas even teaches the Nazi a simple trick that impressed his daughter. The Reichsmarschall optimistically hopes to personally impress the girl when he is released. The German also encourages the doctor, saying that he can surpass his father, a simple worker content with his craft, and make his mark in history. Douglas's enthusiasm is not dampened even by Sergeant 300's comments that he has become too influenced by the prisoner's worldview. However, he hands Judge Jackson a draft of the statement that Göring is going to read during the Nuremberg trials. The trial is scheduled for the next day. In the morning, the Reichsmarschall gives a speech to his fellow Nazis and prisoners, encouraging them to hold on until the end. In the courtroom, everything is ready for the trial. Microphones are set up for the speakers, headphones for simultaneous translation, and cameras are adjusted to capture the most high-profile case of the century. Colonel Andrus, with a small group of assistants including Douglas, leads the Nazis through a specially constructed wooden tunnel from the prison building to the courtroom. Under the flashes of cameras, the defendants take their seats. When the command "stand up" is given, the court is in session. Göring sits until the last moment, raising luster, thus emphasizing his uniqueness among those gathered. Judge Jackson speaks first, representing the prosecution and urging those present to deliver a fair trial so as not to repeat the horrors of the Nazi regime in the future. Then the defendants are asked to plead guilty or not guilty. Göring begins to make a speech, but the presiding judge interrupts him. The Reichsmarschall pleads guilty. After the session, Douglas goes to Göring's family, where he finds out that the Americans have arrested them. He bursts in at night to Colonel Andrus to ask for leniency towards civilians, but even after a phone call he can do nothing. The decision was made from above. However, the doctor decides not to tell Hermann that his family was arrested, but Dr. Gilbert soon exposes the deception, leading to a scuffle between the psychiatrists to knock some sense into each other. At the next session, a documentary about the horrors of concentration camps is shown to those present, edited from archival footage filmed by soldiers in the last days of the war. The black and white film shows emaciated, starving survivors and piles of dead bodies executed by SS guards. There are so many corpses that they had to be cleared away with an excavator. After the meeting, Douglas, enlightened by what he saw, visits Göring in his cell. Göring continues to insist that he knew nothing. At the same time, he compares the atrocities of his compatriots with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where 150,000 civilians died in one day. The psychiatrist denies it, saying it's different. American aviation bombed military factories by a ridiculous accident located in a residential city. Losing his temper and finally falling out with the patient, the doctor says that he will be hanged and goes to drown his sorrows in a bar. There he meets Lila. Succumbing to her feminine charms, the tipsy and upset Douglas leaves, revealing secret information. What was he doing here? By morning, his story as told by the journalist hits the front pages of the newspapers. Colonel Andrus, after reading the unauthorized report, dismisses Douglas and orders him to go home. The psychiatrist goes to the train station where he meets Sergeant Trista. He admits that he knows German because he spent almost his entire life in Germany, being an atypical Jew with an Aryan appearance. In the late 1930s, when the Nazis were tightening the screws, his parents sent him to the United States, where he stayed with relatives. After the attack on Pearl Pearl Harbor, the guy volunteered and returned to his homeland as part of the American Army. Here he learned that his younger sister managed to reach Switzerland, where she settled with relatives, but his parents ended up in Auschwitz, where they disappeared, apparently becoming one of the many murdered prisoners. Trist, in farewell, asks Douglas not to be indifferent to evil, because it is with the silent consent of such people that all the evil on earth happens. Heeding such a heartfelt speech, the psychiatrist returns to the city. He finds Judge Jackson to hand over his notes and observations on Goering. They might help pinpoint the Nazis' weak spot to defeat him in court. The lawyers decide to use the Reich Marshal's vanity to trap him and make him confess his criminal acts. On the day of Goering's interrogation, Douglas returns to the courtroom even though he is not officially supposed to be there. During the arguments with Judge Jackson, the defendant remains confident and persistently sticks to his own position. He acted solely for the benefit of his native country and did not give any orders for mass killings. Although Goering was an honorary Obergruppenführer of the SS, the real power over the units belonged to Heinrich Himmler. He should be held accountable for all the atrocities committed by the SS. Goering claims that the labor camps were created as a measure against communists, to prevent them from accidentally seizing power from the Nazis. After Hitler came to power, his party relentlessly crushed competitors to make Germany great again. For this, the Nuremberg race laws were enacted, restricting the rights of Jews. Jackson believes that the final solution to the Jewish question, which Goering himself signed, implied physical extermination and mass killings. As evidence, the lawyer shows a document signed by the Reichsmarschall himself. However, the defendant claims that he personally meant their resettlement and even points to lines in the document to confirm this. What Himmler did is another matter. Realizing that the client is slipping away from punishment, Fife replaces the American colleague in the interrogation. He reminds that 6 million people were killed in concentration camps over several years. Then he asks, knowing everything he knows now, would Hermann Göring have obeyed Hitler? Unable to betray the Führer, the Reichsmarschall answers affirmatively and voices the classic Nazi salute. This is enough for those gathered to consider him guilty. On September 30th, 1946, the verdict is announced in Nuremberg for the top leaders of Nazi Germany. Hermann Göring is found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The date of the execution is kept secret to avoid unrest, but it is carried out at midnight, shortly before inviting a group of selected journalists. The prisoners themselves are woken up 15 minutes before it begins. However, when Colonel Andros informs the journalists why they have been invited to the room with the gallows, he is informed that Göring has been found dead in his cell. He took cyanide from a hidden capsule and retrieved it using a trick he learned from Douglas. The execution begins with the next senior prisoner, propagandist Julius Streicher, who wet himself at the moment of execution. Returning to America, Douglas Kelly wrote a book about his experiences titled 22 Cells in Nuremberg. While promoting it on the radio, the psychiatrist admitted that he is frightened by the fact that the Nazis do not have any distinct traits by which they can be identified. Moreover, Douglas himself is convinced that the United States is full of citizens ready to commit similar atrocities if they come to power. After these words, he is politely asked to leave the studio. The film ends with a brief historical note on the subsequent fate of the participants in these events. Judge Jackson returned to the Supreme Court and Douglas's book did not gain popularity. The doctor himself poisoned himself with cyanide after a prolonged depression.